What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to College Football Talk with Peter Burtnett. In today's episode, going over the Week 7 action. Obviously, there was a huge game out in Eugene with massive stakes and a big win for the Oregon Ducks. I'm going to be going over all the action, starting with that game. But before I do, if you go on to enjoy this video, please feel free to leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on those post notifications so you're always up to date whenever I upload. But for those of you who have watched the channel, and I guess if you're watching for the first time, you can see in the background, yes, I was born and raised, and I have been a Buckeye fan. I'm not sure if it's showing up here. I might have to get up a little bit here, but I'm repping the CLE for the Cleveland Guardians. Their win over the Detroit Tigers in Game 5 of the ALDS kind of lessened the blow for me as a Buckeye fan with our loss in what was the game of the year, Part 2. As the Oregon Ducks, number 3 in the country, beat the number 2 Ohio State Buckeyes. The Ducks get a bump up to number 2 after the win. The Buckeyes slipped down to, I think, number 4 in the AP poll and 5 in the coaches poll, so not surprisingly still a top 5 team. I don't think the Buckeyes are really in any danger at all after this game. Of course, the discussion mostly around this game is around Ryan Day's inability to win the big games. I believe this drops him to 1-7 against top 5 opponents. And of course, Will Howard's decision-making late. I want to just say, though, it didn't come down, and it shouldn't come down to just one play. I mean, Will Howard, it looks like from what I've seen, he was looking at the play clock, at the game clock, actually, on that slide. But really, Ohio State, they had mistakes on that drive. I think they were maybe inside the 30 or inside the 35, certainly. And then they have a penalty, a kind of iffy offensive pass interference call against Jeremiah Smith. Saw a couple of things on Twitter or X about how because it was less than 5 yards, so it was just him trying to create separation in a way that was legal. I'm not here to dispute that call. I'm simply presenting some things that I saw from what appeared to be pretty unbiased sources on Twitter. I'll have to look at those and double check, but either way, that is a mistake there. Whether it's the right call or not, I'm not going to discuss too much more here. But I think overall, still, it was missed opportunities for the Buckeyes. But you cannot take away from the way that Oregon looked in this game. They played in a way that put them in the opportunity to win the game. And I think they looked every bit the national championship contender. This puts them as the favorite in the Big Ten, though I think Penn State also, in their win this weekend, proved that they are a solid team as well. More about the Nittany Lions in a couple of points here. But Oregon, they could have even won this game by a little bit. They had the play in the red zone where Trayshawn Holden spit on an opposing player, which honestly is disgusting and I think warrants potentially a suspension. I know football is a physical game, but something like that is just dirty and gross. So the right decision there to eject him from the game. They also had opportunities where they were held to a field goal. Just overall, I think they could have won by even more, but the Ducks did what they needed to do to win this game. They get a go-ahead field goal late, obviously before the Buckeyes drive I talked about. Dylan Gabriel, Jordan James, Evan Stewart all stepped up big. Gabriel was highly efficient with the ball. I think threw for over 340 yards, a couple of touchdowns. Evan Stewart had over 100 receiving yards. And Jordan James, Nick Saban, I think, talked about his running ability, or maybe it was one of the other guys on the College Game Day set, because I think Saban was talking about Ashton Genty out at Boise State. But either way, they talked about his ability to bounce off of tackles, his ability to just move well and create space and opportunities. He ran for over 100 yards. I think he was an underrated piece, both of the Oregon Ducks team and also of their win. So it's a big win for Oregon. They're next up at Purdue on Friday night. That's not a game they can overlook, although the Boilermakers have not looked good this season. Notre Dame dominated them in West Lafayette. But I think because it's a Friday night game, West Lafayette is going to be bouncing for that one. And it's, we've seen teams go in there before, Ohio State included, and lose the big games or at least be pushed. So certainly not a game the Ducks can overlook. Then after that, they're home against Illinois, who actually just beat those Boilermakers in a thrilling 50-49 overtime game. So the Fighting Illini stay in the top 25, and then at Michigan, who's obviously had their issues. Once they get past that, I think it's Maryland and Washington, and I'm blanking on their third opponent after those games. But honestly, Oregon looks like, as long as they can avoid those pitfalls, they look like they're going to probably finish the regular season undefeated. But we said that about, the way Alabama looked after their win over Georgia, that they looked, like they wouldn't drop a game. Then they lose to Vanderbilt, who continues to impress, not taking it away from them. So for Oregon, they get a big win. Ohio State has a bye week to refocus, learn from this, adjust, and then they get Nebraska at home in a game that's already been announced as big noon kickoff. Their goals are still ahead of them, I think. They have a schedule that has kind of gotten tougher after Nebraska. Then they have the big one on the road again in State College against Penn State. And then after that, it's a home game against Purdue, at Northwestern, at Wrigley Field, home against Indiana, and home against Michigan to wrap up the regular season. So Ohio State's season is not easy the rest of the way, so they're certainly going to need to play good football. I think they can afford to lose one of those, especially if it's the Penn State game, but that would, they want to win the Big Ten, so that would take them out of that discussion. I think if Penn State wins, I think that all but clinches an Oregon-Penn State matchup in the Big Ten championship game. But let's get right into it, actually. I was going to talk about a couple other points first, but because I'm talking about them, Penn State goes into the LA Coliseum and comes away with a close 33-30 win in overtime. Drew Aller threw for almost 400 yards and a couple of touchdowns, and the Nittany Lion defense did pretty well considering the offense that Miller Moss runs at USC. I think Penn State did well to get out of there with a W. It has been tough sledding for teams traveling more than 2 time zones. I think going into that game, there's something like 1-9 in the Big Ten this year, with obviously the expanded conference either going to the West Coast or West Coast teams coming to the Midwest. It's been tough sledding. It was for Ohio State too. I think Indiana was the only other team to win when going on the road. They won at UCLA. Penn State became the second team to do that. And they have, again, established themselves. They got the big one against Ohio State, a team they have not been able to beat since, 2016? I think was the last time Penn State beat Ohio State. So that one is going to be huge in Happy Valley. And both of those two teams, I think, going into that one will have a combined, 1 loss. I think Penn State should remain undefeated going into that one. But good win for the Nittany Lions against the USC team that is, at this point now, in win or go home, basically, the rest of their schedule at 3-3. They're going to have to win out, and even then, they're going to be borderline for college football playoff consideration. They're already outside the top 25. Now shifting gears, looking at the SEC. Texas, going over this one quickly, it wasn't close. They remain the number 1 team. I think they look like the best team in college football. They rout Oklahoma after a slow start. They trailed 3-0 after the first quarter, but they rattled off 21 in the second quarter and 34 unanswered to cruise to a win in the Red River rivalry. The Sooners offense continues to struggle. Michael Hawkins threw for 148 yards, and as a team, they only rushed for 89, and they also lost a couple of fumbles. Oklahoma at this point, their season, I think, is probably done, at least for playoff consideration after this loss. Yes, it's 2. Yes, their losses are to top 10 teams, but I think they don't have enough of an offense unless they really make some adjustments to compete in the SEC. For Texas, meanwhile, they've got a big one that I'm going to dive into more in my next video. They're home against number 5 Georgia in another marquee game that is up there as a candidate for Game of the Year, at least going into it. The first 2 have delivered. The first 2 top 5 matchups have delivered so far. I would expect this one to as well, though I think Texas looks really good, and Georgia has looked a little shaky. But again, I'll talk more about that in my next video. Another thing, Death Valley magic continues. Number 13 LSU stunned number 9 Ole Miss late. Not stunned in the aspect of it being a major upset, but they scored a late touchdown. Garrett Nussmeier to Aaron Anderson for a game-tying touchdown. Their defense stiffened in overtime, holding the Rebels to a field goal. Overall, played pretty well also against a high-powered, prolific Ole Miss offense that has struggled at times this year in their loss to Kentucky especially. But still, it's Jackson Dart powers that offense really well. And then Nussmeier to Kyron Lacey for the game-winning touchdown on the first play of their possession in overtime. So the Tigers improved to 5-1. They're 2-0 in SEC. That loss to USC doesn't look good, but it won't matter if the Tigers can keep winning, especially in SEC play. They're going to have at Arkansas and at Texas A&M, a couple of tough road games back-to-back. Arkansas has already shown they could beat a top 10 team in Fayetteville when they upset Tennessee a couple weeks ago. Then they're home against Alabama, at Florida, home against Vanderbilt, which is actually kind of maybe tougher than we might have expected, and home against LSU. I think out of that schedule, the toughest two there are probably at Texas A&M and home against Alabama. If LSU can win one of those games, they're probably looking at making the SEC championship game where they would probably go up against Texas, I would assume, unless Georgia can throw a wrench in that game this week. The Rebels, meanwhile, they drop another. I think they kind of have slipped out of the college football race. It looked like they were in a favorable position to do well, but they've lost a couple games I didn't really expect them to lose. LSU definitely was one. That Kentucky one was absolutely unexpected, so I think they're kind of out of the picture. And talked about that Death Valley magic. Brian Kelly is now 12-0 in night games at Tiger Stadium, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. A couple other teams out of the SEC. Number 7 Alabama survived a home scare against South Carolina 27-25. They continue to, outside of that game against Georgia, they've really kind of, they haven't looked great this season, but South Carolina has proven to give teams some struggles. They absolutely dominated Kentucky in spite of Kentucky playing Georgia tough and beating Ole Miss. Georgia was kind of unimpressive, especially defensively against Mississippi State in a 41-31 win. And then Tennessee, I had predicted a Florida upset, and boy, was I close. Obviously, really tough blow for the Gators, losing Graham Mertz to a torn ACL for the rest of the season. I think DJ Lagway, though, has been able to step up in spots for Mertz, who's been kind of dealing with injuries off and on and kind of struggling a little bit. They played Tennessee tough. They were able to get a late touchdown to force overtime, but then Tennessee was able to win it in OT after the Gators missed a field goal. Tennessee punched in a touchdown. So those three teams, all in the SEC, continue to win, not exactly in impressive ways, but winning is what's most important, and so those three teams in the top 10 all get it done. Another top 10 team, and these next two teams that I'm talking about have really turned things around from either one bad game in the case of Clemson or kind of a couple of shaky ones and one bad loss in the case of Notre Dame. Clemson absolutely wiped Wake Forest out of their home field 49-14, and then Notre Dame continues to rattle off wins as they dominated Stanford this last week. I think both of those two teams, they're already in that range of being top 12 teams, so they're already in that playoff consideration. Clemson has got I think a pretty favorable schedule the rest of the way. They've got a couple tough games, and I think Notre Dame, USC looked like it might be a tough one, but the Trojans have been iffy. Florida State, obviously at this point, I think that if Notre Dame lost that one, that would be a shock. So these two teams are looking good. Elsewhere in the Big 12, their two unbeaten teams, Iowa State and BYU, continue to win. Those teams both picked up big wins. Also, Kansas State won late at Colorado. The Buffaloes were without Travis Hunter and Jimmy Horn for most of that game. Hunter went out early with an injury. I think he played something like 44 of the first 45 snaps and then missed the rest of the game for the Buffaloes. Shedeur Sanders played well, but ultimately was kind of beaten out by Avery Johnson and DJ Giddens on Kansas State. They had a big win. Then, talked about him earlier, Ashton Jeanty rushed for over 200 yards again in a 28-7 win at Hawaii. He continues to look like the Heisman frontrunner so far and just continues to churn out these 200 yards games. Then, a couple of teams who are notably 6-0. Pitt, with a win over Cal at home, improves to 6-0 for the first time since 1982. And then how about the military academies outside of Air Force, I guess? Army and Navy are both 6-0, and they enter into the top 25 at the same time for the first time since 1960. Those teams, both in the American Conference together for the first time this year, are looking like the teams to beat in that conference, and they are on a collision course to face back-to-back weeks. Obviously, potentially in the American Championship game, December, I think, 7th, and then this year, their annual contest is December 14th. So that would not have any bearing, the December 14th matchup on the college football playoff, but obviously the American would. These two teams are both ranked. The difficult thing for both of them, though, is they're probably going to need Boise State to slip up. I think either one of these teams... You know what? Pause on that, because if one or both of these teams finishes undefeated, it would mean that they have a win over Notre Dame. Both of these teams get the Fighting Irish. I believe Army is playing the Fighting Irish this coming week. That's actually a big game, an important ranked game for both of these teams. That would be a game for Notre Dame. I mentioned they didn't really have too much of a tough schedule. That's one. And then Navy in a few weeks as well. So both of those two teams, if they can get a win over Notre Dame, they are serious contenders to be right up there against Boise State, Boise State, their one loss is to Oregon. That's probably going to be the best loss for any team this season outside of, maybe Georgia if they lose to Texas this coming week. But that is always going to be a resume booster, especially because they played the Ducks tough. But that's kind of a rundown. Let me know if you want me to kind of take a further look at Army and Navy. I'll have that video coming out in a few days, previewing Week 8. But let me know your thoughts on this last week of college football, what kind of your takeaways were. But that's all for this episode of College Football Talk. I'm your host, Peter Burtnett, signing out. Peace.